Speech in 3, 2, 1, go. When your state is in desolation, the last thing you want is more division. This motion is a problem-solution mismatch that government defended and failed. Multi-perspectives, inclusion of minorities, and rebuilding with unity is what they need to build a nation. Clarifications before my responses. First is, government was wrong in telling us that this is the burden is to like have this rational attempt to exist, because this is not a PHBDX should, this is a this house would. The burden must then be on the effectivity and the sustainability of both of these policies. Second, government whip doesn't necessarily evolve this case meaningfully. Take their speech away, the substance remains the same coming from their side. This is why a lot of the POIs and the responses coming from Kuya Joseph and Kuya Matthew was important to address before they are actually able to move on with the rebuilding. Two responses before I move on to my weighing. First, when it comes to the understanding for the reason of the conflict, Kuya Joseph already proved many instances of conflict come because you have the creation of in-groups and out-groups, like what we saw with the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and the apartheid regime in Africa. That is to say, the plurality of ethnicity in a globalized world is at the heart of true state formation and national identity. Second, Deputy Prime Minister had little to no response to Kuya Joseph. They are obsessed with short-term conflict that they fail in the long term. I'll explain on this later, but the creation of a national identity needs to have the plurality of perspectives, as what Kuya Joseph said, mentioned in the POI, we literally might have no conflict, but in the long run, these states are selfish and likely to reinforce cronyism, historical revisionism, and racist lines of rhetoric with little to no interactions with other ethnicities. And third, government's case just presupposes that the end goal is seclusion and division. As what we said, since the beginning, the authoritarian ethnic cleansing is literally what we fought against. They have no response to the Matthew's extension on bolstering our comparative democracy. Three characterizations before I move on to the issues. First, who are the most fit for federalist systems? Strong states benefit from federalist system because of capacity, not because of territorial assertion. LGU still exists in our world, as what both Kuya Sef and Kuya Matt explains. The failure on government side was assume that when you give these minorities their ability to govern themselves in their little spaces, that they're going to be able to do that particular thing, right? To illustrate, when it comes to the power dynamics between, for example, US and Cuba, just because they're neighbors, just because Cuba has their own land, doesn't mean that the bigger state, US, is not able to influence them. For example, through sanctions, starving a lot of Cubans in that area. Their model is a microcosm of that in this particular post-conflict states. Second, what exactly was their counterfactual? Because I feel like from DPM and government whip, they really weren't able to respond to this. Even if you take the preemption coming from Yuan about the bad things that happens in unitary systems, they were not able to really prove this on like a deeper level of analysis that actually contended with what we actually provided in our speech. For example, the nuances of how LGU still exists, so you still have decentralization, on how singular national identity is better in the long run, other than like the federalist system that they're trying to prevent. And again, this is not a federalist system. This is an ethnic federalist system. So DPM's harm being pushed to us on how these people have different identities, meaning they have like a wider scope of conflict, applies to them worse because you give them their own turfs, you give them their own bases, and you give them a reason to snap in the long run. Thirdly, why is tension necessary to build the best discussion of rights? This is really important because coming from Kuya Matthew, coming from Kuya Matthew and Kuya Sef, they were able to explain that, oh, yes, tension is going to exist in the short term. Sure, we have this, but the problem with government's case is that they're just going to want to not have any conflict when the conflict already ended. Meaning then that for you to have the best discussion among these groups of people is to band together, even if it's going to be under one umbrella. Sure, you say that it's immoral to make these minorities like come to these people or like work together with these other people, but you're not gonna get anything better for them if you just push them away and make these people who are already able to capacitate themselves like be on themselves. Sure, I'll take the point.
Okay. In other words, what you call a short-term solution is actually the necessary precondition for long-term stability. Long-term unity, the way you describe it, cannot be built on forced coexistence under the narrative of fear. When these communities believe the state may dominate them, the resentment deepens and it's way worse under your side. Please engage.
Okay. I'll engage on that because that's literally going to be within my extensions, right? So, when it comes to how these minorities are able to feel secure, it's going to be worse on your side because you have unchecked leaders in those regions. This is what Deputy Prime Minister and government needed to respond to, because if you don't address how federalist states are able to coalesce this power or have decentralization of power within those states, it's harder for other federalist states to combat them, because who gives a fuck about them, right? So first issue then, which policy actually has better optics to rebuilding the state in the long term, right? So Katrina's response to the POI on potential long-term prospects is utterly dismissive. This is important in our model because it is the one that closes the wounds government keeps trying to claim. Can you imagine collaboration when people are racist towards each other? How can you live in a state like that? Even when Yuan talked about how this conflict's not happening is a good thing, it's still under as to how this leads to a less polarized nation, because DPM and government whip failed to even engage with this. The best case is that they grow to be sustainable independently, but the problem is that they don't have any national identity. So this is consistent with Kuya Sep and Kuya Matt. You go back to the conflict because the reason that this conflict began with is the differences that happens. So on our side, we embrace these tensions early on because on the long-term prospect, we have this national identity. So Kuya Matt talks about how different regions are unlikely to be good, right? So this means then that even under the worst case of dictatorship, the reason that this is not likely to be sustainable is that first, a lot of dictatorships need to have like a long-term period of time. So if this happens in the short term, as what Kuya Matt mentioned, is that if people don't like it, they're able to call this out. Again, people are weak in this particular post-conflict states. They don't have the firepower to like consolidate as quickly as they can. So this is the moment that you're actually going to be able to coincide with each other and settle your differences. And lastly, just who takes care of minorities better, right? Yuan talks about how they're going to be able to protect the minorities. Question, can they govern themselves effectively without assistance from bigger ethnic states? So this was the illustration I gave a while ago on the US and Cuba. They even expounded this by saying that these minorities are morally required to be separated from those that dominated them. At best, these communities can come together if bigger ethnic groups abuse them. But how possible in this under post-conflict states? Kuya Matt clearly explained that malign incentives of these bigger ethnic federal states is able to dominate even in this fantasy world of theirs. With all the reasons, oppose.